It's difficult to answer that straight away because relations are not bad, but they're not that good either. They're somewhere in the middle. There has been a lot of tension, a lot of strain, particularly of an economic nature, but also of a geopolitical nature. So both sides, China and also the Western world, are trying hard to overcome these difficulties and re-establish better relations. Whether that has been successful, it's difficult to judge. We have had a very important summit meeting between President Biden and President Xi in November of last year, and that meeting certainly helped to calm down the atmosphere, to improve relations between both sides. But relations are still not as good as they used to be, let's say, some 10 or 20 years ago. I often hear from Chinese journalists or Chinese academics that they believe the United States influences the EU attitude towards China. I don't think this is true. The European Union is a club of 27 countries, and many of these countries have very individual policies towards China and towards other countries. And the EU Commission in Brussels is also trying hard to establish something like a coherent policy towards China, but also towards other countries. And the EU is an important geopolitical factor, and particularly an important geoeconomic factor. The EU is actually, apart from China, is the largest trade area in the world, larger than the United States. Also, the population of the European Union is larger than the population of the United States. So it is not easy for any outside country, including the United States, to influence or manipulate the European Union. The Europeans, have their own attitude, their own policies. They know what they are doing. But of course, you're right that EU-American relations are close, and that has historical reasons. That also has philosophical reasons. They have a very similar kind of government, a democratic kind of government. They have a capitalist market economy on both sides of the Atlantic. And as you know, many European immigrants came to the United States. So the population of the United States is largely based on the Irish, on the Germans, on many people from Poland and other Eastern European countries which came to the United States some 200 or 300 years ago. And that, of course, has influenced the closeness between the United States and the European continent. Well, in principle, I think China is interested in having good relations with the Europeans, and the Europeans are very interested in having good relations with China. The reasons largely is because of economics and trade. As you know, China and the European Union are the largest trading partners in the world, the largest economic areas in the world. And it is, of course, it makes perfect sense that they want to trade with each other, that they want to have deep economic relations. And that drives the relationship. There are other factors, geopolitical and cultural factors, of course, which are also important and should not be ignored. Also people-to-people exchanges, like the exchanges of academics and students and tourists, of course. All that is important, but the driving force clearly is trade and economics, and for understandable reasons, because both sides, of course, want to improve their living standards. They want to have a good standard of living, and you achieve that by having good economic links with each other. So in principle, I think it's a good relationship which should be developed further. However, in any economic and trade relationship, there are also disagreements and strains and tension. Germany is an export country. 47% of the German GDP depends on exports, which is a huge number. In the United States, it's less than 8%. So if you compare these numbers, then of course you realize immediately how dependent the German economy is on exports. However, of these 47%, half of these exports go to other EU countries. And I think the relationship with China is something like 16.2% of European goods are actually traded with China. And for Germany, the number is a little lower, but quite high. Still, many big German companies, particularly the car companies like BMW, Mercedes, Volkswagen, but also chemical companies like Bayer Leverkusen, like BASF, they are really quite dependent on the huge Chinese market, and they of course are interested in very good economic relations with China. So in principle, to summarize, both sides are highly interested in good economic and export and trade relations with each other, but there are serious obstacles which need to be addressed and overcome. Well, I wouldn't say that France is that different. Also, France is a big exporting nation. It's perhaps technologically not quite as advanced in many areas as Germany, particularly in the car sector or in the chemical sector. But France is an important economic player, which is also highly interested in developing its export and trade relations with China. They are also a geopolitical player, much more so than Germany. So they are also interested in exporting some of their military technology. They have a role to play in the South China Sea and in the Indo-Pacific, because I think over 1 million French people live on islands in the South China Sea and in the wider Indo-Pacific, which is not the case for Germany. So France is also an important player, but has very similar reservations and problems regarding trading and the economic relationship with China. You know, what I mentioned before, the subsidy culture in China, the tendency to take over technological know-how from European companies, that also refers to France. So the problems Germany and France are facing regarding China, at least in an economic sense, are pretty similar. What we see in Europe, if I may say that, is that there is not a common comprehensive strategy towards China. Europe is partially divided, and countries such as Hungary and also, as I mentioned, Serbia or Greece and partially Italy seem to be much closer to China for economic reasons than other countries like Germany and France or the Baltic states or Poland, and that is not good. Europe needs to be united in its foreign policy strategy, and that is what the European Commission is working on. Europe needs to develop a comprehensive, stable and constructive united strategy towards China, but also towards other countries. But Europe at the moment is perhaps too divided to achieve that. But let's be hopeful, and in 10 or 20 years' time that may have been achieved. You can develop good relations, economic and trade and political relations with the United States, and also develop good economic and trade relations with China and other countries. It's not a contradiction in terms. And when you consider the figures, then 40% of all GDP in the world is actually produced by the transatlantic allies, by both Europe and America together. And 40% of all global trade is conducted between the Europeans and the United States in North America. That is a huge number. It's almost half of all world trade. And of course, that is such an important factor. No one is going to give up on that. And on top of that, there are these cultural and political closenesses and historical and other ties and links which tie the two countries, the two continents together. So to expect that the Europeans suddenly turn away from the United States is quite unrealistic for both cultural and historical reasons, and also, as I said, for economic reasons, because the trade relationship, the economic relationship is so important. 40% of all global trade is done between Europe and the United States. However, that doesn't mean you cannot also develop good and better economic and trade relations with other countries, including China. It's not a contradiction in terms. You can have 40% with China and 40% with the United States, or 20% with China and 40% with the United States, as you like. This is quite possible in theory, and I think that is what we should work on. Well, there will always be competition. If you look at two people in the world, two colleagues, there will always be a degree of competition. Look at two economies in the world, two countries, there will always be competition. There's competition between European companies and American companies. That is, I think, unavoidable. That's the nature of inter-country relations. That's the nature of human beings, if you like, that we do compete. It depends on the kind of competition we have. There's nothing wrong with European and Chinese companies to compete with each other in some constructive way, which does not lead to military conflict, but is simple economic competition. And then hopefully the best one wins out, the one who can produce products more cheaply and with better quality. But it depends how that competition is being conducted. If that competition is conducted by unfair means,